I want to thank Dan for the invitation. We've had some nice conversations over the last 6 months or so. I want to get some thank yous out of the way because as it usually goes, by the end, you forget everything and you don't get to do any of that. So thanks to Dan. Thanks to all of you for coming, for giving me 90 minutes of your lives tonight. I hope you don't go away and say, those are 90 minutes I'm never going to get back. The topic is broad and deep. That said, ask questions you might have as we go along. Clarifying early ideas help those ideas as they unfold into later consequences. My last thank you is from my wife Lynn, who we met 50 years ago this past September. And of course that means she's had to hear me ramble about this stuff for 5 decades. So this is the first time I think that she'll probably hear the whole thing in one batch. So here we go. A few things about my background, because one of the infuriatingly and annoying things I get when everybody asks you to send a CV along for any project you're doing, and I always get back the same response. Well, how are you doing this when your degree's in English education? I mean, they love to pigeonhole things because then they don't have to deal with stuff. So my BA is actually from Xavier University in Cincinnati. I have a Master's of Arts in Teaching from Trinity in San Antonio. My PhD is in English education, yes, from the University of Texas at Austin. Notice the focus there on learning, pedagogy, and teaching. My master's is not in English; it's a Master's of Arts in Teaching, which Trinity was one of the first to do that back in 1976. As Dan said, I've completed 42 years of teaching, 37 at Ball State, and 39 courses over 37 years. If you looked at the 39 courses, what you'd notice is a range of learning I've been focusing on, an emphasis on the humanities, the foundation in rhetorical theory. My references in this particular book manuscript run from literature to political science to history to mathematics to theology to philosophy as often as I can. I've served a number of different administrative roles in the university, from department chair to interim associate dean of the College of Sciences and Humanities. I've also served as a number of external positions, director of the Indiana Teachers of Writing, executive director for 9 years of the Association of General and Liberal Studies. I tell you that because in those places, these kind of conceptual ideas are put to a tough test because you've got to put them into practice. And if you're going to be consistent the way you think and the way you speak and the way you do, something that's key in this presentation, then those administrative jobs prepared me for the hard edge of how does this stuff actually work for real. Over 3 decades, I participated in 19 study abroad programs, including 2 semester-length programs at Oxford and London. I was named a university teaching professor and a number of other things. I've had 12 study abroads to England, 7. My last 7 were actually to Greece, along with Keys. For Keys, the Kentucky Institute for National Studies. This is one of my favorite places. This is the Agora in Athens. I've been privileged to hear John Camp, who's been the executive director of research at the Agora since the primordial ooze. I think it's actually in the 50s, and he just retired. This is actually a still from a little 6-minute intro he does on their website. This is the ancient Agora as they have uncovered it since the 1960s. This is a recreation of the Stoa of Attalos. This was built by contributions from American school children. This is the temple to Hephaestus up here. Probably one of the best preserved ancient temples there are. This is the Panathenaic Road, which ran all the way to Eleusis for the Panathenaic procession, and then would curve around this way and go up to the east side of the Acropolis, which sits up here. This is the public center place in Athens. This is where the legislative buildings were, the judicial buildings were, the marketplace, And it's just about the way it's going to be now. They're trying to get a hold of this set of buildings in that street. And you're sitting about 35 feet above ground level when you're on that street. So they have to go all the way down. There's a great building right there, which they just uncovered the corner of, and the rest of it's going to go back into that building. John Kemp says when they get that, they will be finished. They're not going to do any more. They wanted to get all the public buildings of ancient Athens. When you walk through here, which I've done 9-10 times now, you get a distinct feel for that time period. And I think it's important when you work with ideas, as often as possible, you connect those ideas to context and place. One of my first lessons in that was being in the Lake District in England, up where Wordsworth wrote his, I forgot what the name of the poem was, but it's about Michael. And we're sitting in the sheepfold where Wordsworth wrote that. And you get a definite feel for that poem that you don't get sitting in a classroom or sitting in your office or something like that. That connection to place and time, I think, is really important. So I've done a lot of things besides learn how to teach students to write. And all of them you'll see play out in this presentation. When I had my last sabbatical in 2012, we had to do a presentation at the end of it. And I remember beginning my presentation with, this is the argument I've waited my entire life for. And it all comes together in this 340 pages, which is now finished and going out in first draft, this draft, to publishers. And I keep my fingers crossed when I open my email every morning. This thought occurred to me just the other day. The rhetoric tradition of liberal education, which I'm going to talk about in contrast to the philosophy tradition of liberal education, which is the way most people think of liberal education today. The rhetoric tradition of liberal education is not anything outside of you. So for instance, Plato had this idea that these divine ideas are out here that only a few people could reach. The rest of us were not capable of getting outside the cave. In contrast, and this occurred to me right after I wrote that down, this is actually Socrates' idea. Socrates spent all his life bringing ideas out of people. He's not like Plato portrays him. You have to get beyond the Platonic record to the historic record to see a Socrates who was more interested in bringing out of people. The rhetoric tradition of liberal education is in people. We all have it. Later on, I'm going to tell the story of like I think the little guy was 2 years old, who exhibited the kind of 4 concepts I'm going to talk about tonight. At 2 years old, he has those concepts. The idea is, how do those develop? How do we bring them out of ourselves? How do we move them through learning and through mentoring for the benefit of students and for the benefit of a society? I'm going to try to do this in 3 parts. And the first part, admittedly, is very conceptual. So I'm asking that if you have questions, stop me along the way. It's about 4 words. And so stop me along the way if you have any questions, because it's kind of like a snowball. It just kind of rolls along. And I'll be happy to clarify, except for the Christian part at the end, because we'll say that to the end. So the conceptual part, and then how does that make its way into liberal education and learning and teaching for students will be the second part. And that's a little more straightforward. And then the third part, the Christian part, that's very speculative, because I'm not qualified to do that, but I have a whole lot of fun thoughts about it. The argument goes something like this. If the rhetoric tradition of liberal education was dominant in the ancient world, and then I will argue was also dominant in Israel and Judea in the 1st century AD, then to understand 1st century Christianity, you have to go through the rhetorical tradition and not through the philosophy tradition, which gives you a whole different kind of foundational sense of Christianity. That's compliments. I'll tell you a little bit about this. This was my mentor at Texas. He taught the classical rhetoric class, and this was the book he lectured us about in that class that he would later publish, arguing that faith, Christian faith, cannot be understood through theology. It can only be understood through rhetoric. Anyway, more on that as we get down that way. So concepts, education, Christianity. So here we go. I want to start with, what I'm going to put up on the screen will be some longer quotes that won't do me very much good for me to read them, but I hope you'll be able to read them on the screen. And I am told that when this goes into a production, this will be mixed in and out of the screen as I talk. So also, I'll be happy to send these to you afterwards. This is where the book starts. Early in Homer's Odyssey, the goddess Athena visits the young Telemachus in the guise of mentor, which is kind of fun just by itself. Telemachus has grown old enough to see the problems that surround his household, the oikos from what we get the word economy, but worries that he's not mature enough to handle the task at hand. Athena gives him the following advice. Telemachus, you'll lack neither courage nor sense from this day on, not if your father's spirit courses through your veins. Now there was a man, I'd say, in words and deeds both. Early in the Greek tradition, the Greeks understand that maturity involved in thinking clearly, speaking clearly, and acting decisively, and I abbreviate it, thinking, speaking, and acting. Here Athena praises the hero Odysseus for that ability, and Telemachus understands that his progress toward maturity in adulthood, or excellence, the Greek word arete, will be determined by that measuring stick. Aristotle was really, really good at taking all the ideas around him, condensing them down into nice, coherent, analytic patterns. I love that. That's the way my brain works, or used to work all the time. I've tried to kick that habit somewhat too. What Aristotle did, though, when he did that, was he cut out a lot of the really deeper concepts of a lot of those words. So arete shows up in his ethics in a very specific way, but it loses the classical Homeric sense, which is a consistency of speaking, of thinking, speaking, and acting. It's when you get that consistency that you've reached some kind of excellence. So imagine life in the Athenian Agora, spring 365 BC. Isocrates is 71 years old. He's my hero. Plato is 63. Both are experienced educators, their ideas well developed. Aristotle, by the way, is 19. He's been in Athens a couple of years now. He probably knows both Isocrates and Plato, but he's settled in with Plato.
Just for everybody here, as you're going kind of quickly over the names, Isocrates, will you just make sure you're distinguishing him from Socrates?
Socrates, not the same.
Yeah.
Socrates you know about. Isocrates has been wiped off kind of most. In fact, I'll say I didn't hear about Isocrates until that course in classical rhetoric with Jim Canavy in the fall of 1980. And I had a very strong classical-based education. He's my hero because the rhetoric tradition of liberal education comes from him. And Moreau says about him that his ideas dominated classics for 1,000 years. Plato didn't come back to the Renaissance. Ironically, when his manuscripts became more available. I mean, not ironically, I mean, perfectly understandable. And a lot of those became available later on because when the Turks took over Istanbul, a lot of the Byzantine scholars moved to Venice, and they brought the manuscripts with them. Aristotle's manuscripts are a little more dicey in how those came about. They were even buried for a while, but that's a whole separate story. So here in the Agora, we got these two figures, Isocrates, we got Plato. Aristotle is settled in with Plato, and he's gonna stay there until he organizes his school, the Lyceum, after Plato's death. Life has certainly changed in Athens in the last 65 years or so since the start of the Peloponnesian War and Pericles' death. I read this stuff over and I keep thinking about today. The idealistic view of Athens' future painted by Pericles in his funeral oration has dimmed in the face of reality. The bloom on the Athenian democracy has certainly faded. Athens has suffered through a 30-year war of attrition, seen its influence abroad reduced, lost its democracy for a time, and opened itself to the self-inflicted wounds of demagoguery, paralyzing ideologies, and increasing individualism at the expense of the collective whole. Athenians are beginning to wonder if their internal weaknesses will make them vulnerable to external powers for the first time in over a century. Can anybody say Philip and Alexander? In the face of these social realities, Plato and Isocrates not only seek to educate the young in a way that would preserve their culture's values, but rejuvenate them and reorganize them, re-energize them. And they do that from two different perspectives. The philosopher tradition of liberal education. What began with Plato has come down to us as a Platonic tradition of liberal education, which focuses on the autonomous, free individual who pursues knowledge through reason, skepticism, and critical thought. These values have become so ingrained in Western culture that it become valuable as ends in themselves. You often hear people talk about learning for learning's sake, which made perfect sense to me till about 40 years ago. Civic purpose in the philosopher tradition follows from knowledge, though how exactly the conceptual, the knowing, becomes the doing is today usually left up to the individual learner. So we talk a lot about civic education, we talk a lot about the knowing, but how we connect that for at least college-age learners, pretty much left up to the individual learner. People believe this to be the tradition of contemporary liberal education. I did not become aware of the alternate tradition grounded in rhetoric imposed by Isocrates until I was in grad school. And that's in spite of a really solid liberal tradition in classical education. You remember all my training has been in Catholic schools all the way through college. And my undergraduate is at Xavier University, where to get out of the core curriculum, we had to take 30 credit hours in philosophy and theology, just to get out of the core curriculum. This led to my beginning, after looking at the historic record of Isocrates, where he's clearly, and I have a whole list of like 15 references in here to experts saying, we've completely lost Isocrates, and he was dominant over Plato for 1,000 years. But that kind of stuff doesn't work down into most of culture and society. This led to where this began back in 1980, when I began to ask the what if question. If he was that powerful and that successful, the documented winner of the battle in the Agora between him and Plato, how do you do it? What was it? How did this all come about? And that started me on this trail in fall of 1983. Lordy, that's now 40 years ago today. How did he accomplish what he did with his students, and how does that reverberate for us 24 years later? So I want to show you this quote. I'm not going to read this one to you. I think this is from Panathinaikos. He wrote this when he was 98 years old, shortly before he died. Those who have a character which is in accord not with one of these, but with all of them, these I contend are wise and complete, possessed of all the virtues. I would dare any university to graduate its students only on these criteria. You don't graduate. You get 126 credit hours, you get 500 credit hours. If you do this, you don't graduate. Cicero says about Isocrates, from his school as from the horse of Troy, none but leaders emerged. And when historians go back and look through the list of his students, there are all kinds of leaders in the ancient world in Athens and in the cities that sent young men to his school for training. So this, I want you to keep this kind of in the back of your head. This is the graduation criteria that Isocrates talked about, and if we believe the historic record, he succeeded in doing with his students. With that in mind, I want to now go through 4 characteristics of his school, 4 words. I don't remember who said this. I wasn't prepared to say this. I looked it up. It said you can understand classical culture if you just know the vocabulary, which is somewhat of an understatement. But if you look at the complexity of the words, you can uncover a lot about it. So I want to start with, actually I want to go to the end here because I want to show you the end point here. The summary of the rhetorical foundation of liberal education. This is the end point. This is what I'm going to try to get to in a half hour. There we go. As rhetorical humans, we use logos in context of nomos to seek phronesis, deciding how and when to speak and act through kairos. There are the 4 words. Logos, phronesis, nomos, and kairos. Kairos catalyzes logos, phronesis, and nomos. In other words, those 3 words just sit there until kairos, the timely, jolts them into action. And of course, that's what we don't do in higher education, in most cases. That's what that previous screen was all about, is how do students do these things? How do leaders do these things? And that's all set in motion by kairos, or the timely. Kairos pulls together thought, speech, and action, practicality, and context at the decisive moment. Rhetoric becomes meaningful at that moment. In the rhetorical tradition of liberal education, kairos releases power, that's dunamis, when we get dynamic in human life. It turns logos, phronesis, and nomos from static concepts to dynamic principles of living. When I get to that quote, that's going to make perfect sense to you. Little of my Catholicism comes through, sorry. So here's where we're going to start. And I want to explain how we get to this point. Logos connects the external to the internal. I was talking to somebody earlier about, oh, he's not here, a student who left. We were talking about writing. Writing takes what's up in here and it makes it visible down here. So logos connects the external to the internal, not just tying thought to expression, but also our intentions to our actions. In other words, speech expresses thought, to think and to speak, and makes possible consistent action based on those thoughts and words. We think, we say, and we do. And remember, that's what Athena said to Telemachus. When you think and say and do consistently, you'll be a man like your father, the hero. That struggle to make consistent what we think, say, and do defines for Isocrates our human potential, our human burden, and our human power. That struggle also defines our humanity, our arete, our excellence as human beings, our humanitas. Humanitas is the subject for the entire chapter 2 in the book, which I'm going to reduce to pretty much one diagram. So that's to come. So how do we get to this point? In Bruno Schnell, in his book, The Discovery of Mind, he talks about how the Greeks come to discover their own powers, their own intellectual power, their own agency. In that book, he talks about the necessary point at which human knowledge becomes different from divine knowledge. Humans understand that their knowledge is different from what the divine. And he says about Homer and the Greek heroes, it never would have occurred to the Greek heroes that their actions, their excellence came from anything other than the divine, from the direct intervention from the gods. Of course, that's not what we think about human agency. Human agency is our agency. So we'll start talking 600, 500 BC, the concept of human knowledge and divine knowledge starts to separate. And you start getting the early pre-Socratic philosophers talking about that distinction. So the philosophy tradition of liberal education, let's go on that side first. For Heraclitus, the great pre-Socratic philosopher, logos is the law of the universe. It may be something like natural law, but it would go beyond that. It's ordered, it's rational. And it is revealed or not to humans, depending on what pre-Socratic philosopher you were. Either you could have access to the organizing principles of the universe or not. I went to a lecture, one of those darn things I stumbled into when I was a grad student at the University of Texas by Stephen Weinberg, who was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, also a poet, I didn't realize at that time. Texas had just hired him, not only him, but his entire small reactor, about 30 grad students and about 10, this is what a real hire is, I guess, in the big schools, and about 10 other professors to come to the University of Texas. He gave his lecture, believe it or not, on beauty. And I stumbled into it. I figured, this looks interesting. I don't know why. Maybe you weren't home that night or something. I decided to go to it. It's had long thoughts in my head ever since.
Who was this, Paul?
Stephen Weinberg, Weinberg. Yeah, ERG. And he talked about how do physicists like him know they're right. And you talk about science and all the scientific method. He goes, nah. We look at someone and think, oh, that's beautiful. And he says, that's how they connect to the laws of the universe. And he says their job is then to rationally try to understand that reaction. And also, in his way, get to it in science, through science. And so for him, the principles are out there. Humans can glimpse at them, but we fight our way up to try to understand them and to put them into words. Heraclitus emphasizes some exclusivity here, for instance, by, quote, those who are awake. An exclusivity that parallels that of Plato, for whom only the philosopher king can lead or use rhetoric. Only the philosopher king can use rhetoric in Plato's system because only the philosopher king knows the truth about which he can speak. All the rest of us, we play our roles in the world, in Plato's system. I've never understood why, when people make Plato the great paragon of democracy, Plato hated democracy. Plato will agree with Heraclitus' assertion that universal logos exists and can be grasped by some in the form of truth, universal forms and ideas. That exclusivity plays out for us today with such questions as, who should go to college? There's a lot buried behind that. You should, you shouldn't. Who clearly sees the issues that plague our society and who doesn't? You can speak, you shut up. Who's qualified to lead? You, but not you. There's an exclusivity to that sense of knowing. And all of those questions are based on a sense of exclusivity, one directly traced to Plato and then to Heraclitus. Today, we're less inclined to believe that universal logos embodies our creative ability, our critical ability, except for maybe in the sciences. I would include mathematics in this, to let my math Okay, back there. But we're just as prone to emphasize Plato's sense of exclusivity about the ability to think critically, to develop and apply a razor-sharp ability to define and classify and expose the basic principles of a concept or argument. Modern liberal education stresses the same critical thinking of Heraclitus, Plato, and Aristotle, though shorn of its foundation in truth or certainty. It would be inaccurate to call our sense of critical thinking today Heraclitean light, but it would be accurate to say that at the center of liberal education today, our educational institutions value a critical ability, even a skepticism, directed toward the world in order to hone inward a logical human mind. In fact, recent national surveys report that a vast majority of institutions, 98% in 2015 and 87% in 2022, adopted critical thinking and analytic reasoning as a common learning objective for all students. Whenever I see that in a university, all my alarm bells go off. It would also be accurate to say educational institutions, some faculty and some civic leaders, see this high-level critical thinking ability as not being equally distributed among the typical college-going population. I talked to a department chair one time and I asked him, because I knew some of the new pedagogy for his discipline. I'm not going to say what the discipline was. And I asked him why there was like 40% fail rate in the basic classes. His response was, well, that's just the national average. There's nothing we can do about that. Plato, anyone? So that's kind of a look at philosophy, the philosophy aspect of critical thinking tied to this idea of divine logos. So here's Isocrates' response. Remember, these guys are living together. In fact, their grad students are arguing back and forth in their grad papers. No kidding, they make public their responses. Aristotle's first paper was probably a response to Isocrates', one of Isocrates' ideas. It was called Against Gryllus. We ought, therefore, not show ourselves intolerant toward that power which is the source of most of our blessings. He's talking about logos, in a rhetorical logos. For in the other powers which we possess, we are in no respect superior to other living creatures. Nay, we are inferior to them in swiftness and in strength and in other resources. But because there has been implanted in us the power to persuade each other and to make clear to each other whatever we desire, not only have we escaped the life of wild beasts, but we have come together and founded cities and made laws and invented arts. And generally speaking, there's no institution devised by humans which the power of speech has not helped us to establish. For this it is which has been laid down laws concerning things just and unjust, things honorable and base. And if it were not for these ordinances, we would not be able to live with one another. It is by this also that we confute the bad, extol the good. Through this, we educate the ignorant and appraise the wise, for the power to speak well is taken as the surest index of a sound understanding. And discourse which is true and lawful and just is the outward image of a good and faithful soul. Notice that last sentence. If we speak well, it is a reflection of what we think. So we think clearly, it gets expressed in our language, in our speech clearly. That those reflect one another is an indication of an outward image of a good and faithful soul. And as he says, the surest index of a sound understanding. Now, to get something out of the way, I didn't put in my notes, but it may be popping into some people's minds. He did not think the power of logos was equally distributed either. He thought that he talked about practice, training, and exercise, physical or mental exercise. He said, but he did say that anybody can improve on one's discourse ability if they put those efforts to work. So he does believe that talent is not distributed evenly, but he does believe everybody can improve. I taught freshman writing 103 every year that I taught at Ball State, at least. And I go into that class with that in mind. And those kids don't believe it. You have to first make them believe this.
This that they can get better at?
That they can get better at. And that's important to them. And that in fact, later on I'm going to talk about when we know we've lost the argument. One of the things is when the educators start talking about motivation. If you start talking about motivation, you've lost the argument. Because the power of speech and expressing yourself is so clearly, innately motivating that the minute you have to get them from external to motivate, you're losing the argument. You have to get them to innately feel that connection between their thought and their word. That's the challenge in 103. A challenge which I heartily take up. It's a lot of fun. This notion of logos is a much older notion than Plato and Aristotle's about reason and argument. For them, logos connects the external to the internal, not just tying thought to expression, but also our intentions to our actions. In other words, speech expresses thought, and as such it makes possible consistent action based on those thoughts and those words. That struggle to be consistent is our human destiny. It's a root of our humanity. What I want to say is our humanitas. For Isocrates, one accepted one's duty as a free person to think, to engage in language, and to create the society free humans are capable of building. The cognitive challenge is clear. As humans, we struggle to develop our thought, to understand it, and then to instantiate those thoughts in language. In that struggle, we simultaneously define ourselves and live out our human potential. While today we see infinite gaps between thoughts and words, just think advertising, Isocrates saw a bridge that defined us as humans, both in what we could cross and what we should bridge, that we should bridge thought and action. Not to cross that bridge would be inhuman, and equally inhuman would be to sloppily or neglectfully ignore this need for consistency. The focus on logos as think into say contrasts sharply with the earlier focus on critical thinking, even though it evolves from the same starting point, Heraclitus. As noted earlier, for Heraclitus, the ultimate goal of human knowledge is to understand the purpose which steers all things through all things. And that purpose is logos, the intelligible law of the universe. The intelligible law of the universe manifests itself in its concrete creation. And we try to understand it back through the concrete. Okay? As thinking beings, humans are open to logos because it manifests itself in the human, revealing itself through significant particular events which humans use as symbols to apprehend the divine. So as humans, we try to apprehend the divine and we try to express it in our language. But that's just not all. Logos is not released from language. Plato wanted to get beyond language, which is why he was so interested in mathematics. For Isocrates, logos is released through language. Where Plato distrusted all things sensual, material, and physical, Isocrates binds humans to the physical nature of speech, through which we do not find truth but our own humanness. Not only do we use speech to understand the divine, but we imitate speech when we create from our mind into our words. So what makes speech essential for Isocrates is not just that we use this in thought and language to try to understand what is beyond us, but in our creation of it, we mimic it. And that's why it's so important to him. Some contrast between Plato and Isocrates, the philosophy and the rhetoric. In both views, logos is embodied in matter, the basis of human consubstantiality. But Plato, speech is a manifestation of reality. Reality discloses itself through language, and we as humans have power to unconceal reality via logos, but not enough for Plato, for most of us. We can't get there for most of us for Plato. For Isocrates, logos is a creative force that shapes thought and action and our identity as human agents. Our expression of logos echoes the expression of logos inherent in the physical world. We as humans are creating our physical world in our speech and in our actions. For Plato, language conceals, while for Isocrates, logos creates. To circumscribe and define the existence to impose order on experience, humans echo the process of embodying logos by partaking in the same creative expressive power, and the better they embody logos, the more they fulfill their potential as humans. This embodiment of logos is exactly what humans are meant to do. It's the root of our humanity to embody that creative expression and of the humanities themselves. Questions? I think I'm trying to see if I want to leave it there so I can move on to Phronesis.
Can you place Plato relative to Isocrates in terms of connection to the Stoic tradition?
Stoic tradition. The Stoics were in,
place it all into Adam Smith later on. So.
Yeah, the Stoics were in many ways. Well, Isocrates wanted to call himself a philosopher, but you'll see he's going to do that in a very specific way. For Plato, the philosopher was the only one who could see into the divine. For Isocrates, a philosopher was anybody who worked continually on his efforts to understand the practical result of something. So in other words, it wasn't the practical result, it was who worked on one's methods for. That's not going exactly where I wanted to go with this. Oh, Plato wanted to call himself, or Isocrates wanted to call himself a philosopher, but what he really was a continuation of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the sophists. Only he had a much deeper sense of sophism, more like Protagoras, not like Lysias and Gorgias. A lot of the Stoics come out of the sophist tradition, especially where you're linking them to, I'm thinking of De Rerum Natura by Lucretius, which is connected to a sense of nature. Remember, science comes out of natural philosophy. So science comes from philosophy, an understanding of the natural part of philosophy. So a lot of the Stoics come through that tradition. The pre-Socratics, the sophists, into I'm trying to look at quickly in my head. I mean, you have the Stoics, but you also have the Epicureans. They were very close in their starting points. I'm not sure how far you want me to get into
that's
that.
Fair enough. One other question: arete, excellence. Is that also the root for artifact?
Probably, yeah. I'd have to look at the etymology for that.
Okay, thanks.
Remember, arete is thinking, speaking, doing. The first two parts of that is logos, thinking, speaking. When you go into doing, that carries out the trifecta, you might say. And so arete and excellence is the ability to use logos consistently in one's public life, in one's public actions. Well, private actions too, but public actions.
So far, loving this, learning a ton about Isocrates. I see, though, as a, dare I say, in this context, a fairly large fan of Plato.
So was I.
Plato, I see a both and scenario, and I'm wondering if with Plato, there's a school. There are kind of two schools when it comes to the Republic. One of which is probably the broader path, which is the political, the way you're speaking of him, right? Is the philosopher king, being this elite kind of a person,
right.
And but as I read Plato, and there are others that read him this way, that the entire thing of the Republic isn't really about politics at all. It's about the human being. It's about the human soul, right? Socrates says we can't, the soul of a man is small, so if we want to understand justice within the man, let's just blow it up. And the polis is man writ large, so let's look at that. And so everything is a metaphor all the way through, and it comes back together in the myth of Ur at the end brings it back to the human being as opposed to the polis. That's why I'd say I don't really think that the Republic, maybe it's a discussion for another time, but I wonder if you just comment briefly on the and I don't see, like, the cave doesn't, it seems to be his desire is that everybody would come out of the cave. I don't see anywhere in there that's just for the philosopher
Well,
king.
except
But
that
the philosopher king is wisdom, the guardians are courage, everybody else are the desires. When they all work together the right way, we have justice.
I think treating it metaphorically is more a Renaissance Neoplatonism than it is Plato. I think Plato was pretty hard cold. He saw those as political divisions. I'm being tough on Plato. The Neoplatonists democratize Plato. They kind of flatten it out, and they don't limit knowing ideals to just a few philosopher kings. I mean, they kind of flatten it out to kind of a more broad-based. And I think people who tend to read the Republic that way are coming more from a Neoplatonism position rather than a Platonic position. But
Okay.
time for another.
Yeah. We'll chat some more on that. I was
Okay.
curious on your take on that. Thanks.
Just one quick point here. The philosophy tradition of liberal education, with the demise of truth, even scientific truth being under attack nowadays, we have successive generations who are expert critical thinkers, but who are not sure of the goal for well-honed critical abilities. Instead of learning for learning's sake, we unleash critical thinking / skepticism for its own sake. Our well-trained critical graduates can interrogate, critique, and question, but few can explain coherently why, for what purpose. I think we have succeeded with a critical thinking agenda. I'm jumping over many things. Okay with logos at this point? I mean, we have the truth, and then we have logos into thought, word, and action, which mirrors the creative, which mirrors the divine creation of physical life. Okay? All right? That's important for later on. That's why I'm looking around. That's real important for later on. Okay, phronesis. After you get through logos, they kind of fall a little more easily into place. Phronesis is practical wisdom. The second key aspect of Isocrates' liberal education directly follows from logos. Carol Gilligan, in her research on moral decision-making, talks about knowledge embedded in the conditions of life. In other words, education based on logos is by definition embodied or context-bound. Anytime you say context-bound, you get rhetoric, because rhetoric is about context. It's about understanding context, persuading in context. It's not enough to know ideas, concepts, or even processes. One must adapt that knowledge to particular situations. Isocrates calls this type of wisdom phronesis, or practical wisdom. I lost a job at the University of Kentucky by being a smartass about this point. Of course, I didn't really know this back in 1983, but I was in a room with about 35 people, and they were all going to vote on whether I got the job. Turns out I lost by about 5 votes. I'm sure this is what did it. Guy sitting in the back raises his hand, says, what do you think, no, I'm sorry, the guy sitting in front says, what do you think the value are of ed psych classes? You know the cartoon where the little devil sits here and this one says, oh, you know what to say. And this one says, do it. I did it. I said, as they're currently taught, absolutely none. I said, I just came from 4 years teaching high school. if I had not made connections between my ed psych classes and what was happening in the classroom, I probably would have hit that kid on that second year. I said we'd have to do a better job of taking the knowledge that students are getting and help them understand what it looks like when you place it in a room of 30 kids, 16-year-olds who don't want to be there. That's phronesis. You take the knowledge, you put it into real life situations, and you say, what's the practical wisdom I have to develop here? There's a difference between knowing it and knowing what it looks like in conditions embedded in life. The guy laughing in the back guy was the chair of the English department. He knew I did it. He knew I did it. It was a joint position between English and education. I don't regret it. Well, maybe a little. Lexington's pretty. Learning is not just about majoring in a specified body of knowledge. Here's Isocrates. For since it is not in the nature of man to attain a science by the position of which we can know positively what we should do or what we should say, this is his complete cutoff from Plato. In the next resort, I hold that man to be wise who is able by his powers of conjecture to arrive generally at the best course. That's phronesis. And I hold that man to be a philosopher who occupies himself with the studies from which he will most quickly gain that kind of insight. And he's not very specific about what those are, but they're not really subject matters. I mean, there's a look at the learning that's buried in that. There's a lot of mentoring. There's a lot of practice. There's a lot of overseeing by faculty members as students perform, and then a judging of that performance. It's what the literature calls expert-novice learning, or novice-expert learning. And there's a whole pedagogy for how you take novices and move them into expertness. That's what this is. This isn't, I think I say later on, I chaired the first core curriculum assessment at Ball State. It was no surprise to any of us. When we looked at what students learned from the core curriculum, they learned knowledge and nothing else. And if you looked at the core curriculum goals, they were a lot of goals in the nothing else category. Mostly having to do with putting ideas into real practice. There are 4 ideas buried in that quote. We humans are limited in our ability to know what is absolutely true. Therefore, we need to observe what is possible in a given set of practical conditions. Then we should focus on understanding how we might identify the best course to address the problems in life. And someone who loves wisdom, a philosopher, studies just how to most quickly develop that kind of knowing. In Marcia Baxter McGold's developmental research with college students, she calls that contextual knowing. And you'll see some more of that as we go along. And if you look back at this quote here, you see the results of that knowing. We build cities. We define laws. We lay down what is acceptable and not acceptable. And if you look back to this quote, the big one, all of that is about practical wisdom, knowing when to make this decision over that decision. One of my favorite ideas when I think about this kind of stuff is, you know how you're in the middle of an argument? And then in contrast to somebody, you look and say, let's just get rational about this. And my response now is, biological impossibility. You're never, in fact, the research we now shows that most people make their decisions based on emotional reactions first. It's only afterwards that you start thinking about other options and possibilities. By the way, that's exactly what Steven Weinberg says about physicists. They respond to beauty first, and then they invoke the rational scientific method. For Isocrates, wisdom, not just knowledge, emerges within the crucible of real life, the demands of context and decision-making. There's a wonderful writer named Ellen Langer. She talks about the power of the mindful learning. And she's also talking about this as well. I have a number of ideas from her, but I won't go into that just now. But she talks about how most learning strips the context out of learning. So I always think of that when I was teaching honor students, they talked to me about their lab. They were doing lab work. And it sounded to me like the same lab work that I was doing when I was in college. In other words, you do this lab, the outcomes of the lab are already known. How does real science work that way when you take the context out and you already know the results? She says mindful learning should not strip the context from learning. And there should be a number of different outcomes from a particular lab, leading me to say to some of my science colleagues, sometimes I can be irascible lately, that our science programs are good at training technicians, but not at scientists. That comes also from Tom Robbins' books, his novels too. He's good at that kind of stuff. It's also is what I call the big lie of American education. If we identify something that's wrong with the students, like they don't think diverse enough, we throw a course at them. Give them a bunch of reading material, give them a grade at the end, and now they're diverse. Which doesn't explain why those same students who took that class at the University of Texas had one of the most astounding racist homecoming floats I think we've ever seen. There's a difference between knowing it and knowing what it looks like in real life. In summary then, for Isocrates, we use our logos to build our world around us, while we use phronesis to know what and when and how to speak and act with others. Students and philosophers learn to use practical wisdom to face ambiguity, which is what something with a lot of possibilities looks like, the competing interests in their lives, and to make decisions fit to solve problems within their personal, professional, and civic lives.
This is prudence, no?
I had that in my notes. Go back and look up in Jim Canavy how he relates prudence to, it's part of prudence. When I get to kairos, that's part of it too. Kairos morphs, to jump ahead a bit, kairos, the timely, morphs into Roman culture, which is more, it has a certain divine, decided stoic sense to it. Cicero says it becomes propriety. And that's where the prudence flips back in. For the Greeks, kairos is almost completely contentless. It borrows it from the time. This is the time for this decision. But we'll get. So yeah, prudence is in there, probably more so in the concept of kairos and propriety. Nomos. I'm looking at a time.
You're okay.
Okay, but still going to.
Keep going.
Nomos, in classical rhetorical language, means habitual practice, usage, custom, or statute, ordinance made by authority. But if you look back at Homer, there's a point at which the warriors, the leaders, get together for a conversation as to what to do. They sit in a defined area and they talk among themselves, and they pass the staff around for who gets to talk.
Oh, wow.
According to this is, I won't go into the psychology here. I actually went to school with this woman. I don't. I somehow edited her name out of my notes. But in her article about nomos, she says, It evolves to signify habitual practice, usage, or custom. So for instance, where those warriors are talking, nomos becomes the conventions decided by an invested group about what something means, and it becomes the conventions that you have. When this is all finished, you're going to see in rhetoric, logos, phronesis, nomos, kairos, doesn't say a whole lot about what we ought to believe, do in liberal education. Some, but not. The what is defined by nomos. That's how liberal education can move from culture to culture to culture to culture. There's some of it that comes interior to the sense of humans, but a lot of it for, what should be our decision about this case? Well, what's been our past practice? What are our values? Nomos becomes defined by the group as it makes decisions. And so the Greeks had very specific sense of what a democracy was. We don't necessarily have to share that sense of democracy. We have our own tradition in our laws and in our customs and in our beliefs and practices. The rhetorical tradition allows that nomos to morph and move in history as it redefines itself. What's really important for nomos to work, though, is that sense of shared discussion and that sense of freedom to speak and freedom of speech. You cut those out, and the nomos process is just sliced right out of the system. A lot of interesting research about how this evolved for the Greek democracy. A lot of people say it evolved with warriors. That the warriors went to war, and if you know anything about the Greek phalanx, they would not hold the shield in front of themselves. They held the shield in front of the guy next to them, so they could thrust better. And some anthropologists are saying the guys who came back from the battlefield, equal on the battlefield, regardless of where they came from, the farmer, the landowner, the business owner, the politician, they shared it equally on the battlefield. And from that sense of equality came the pressure, the oomph inside of the Greek polis for basic sense of values and principles. I'm shortening a number of different things here in that. There's also a sense of contest and contesting in this. You see it in the Olympics. It's competition, and speech helps to equalize that competition and brings it down to kind of an equal plane.
Can you expand on that a bit? What do you mean by speech brings it to an equal point?
I'm looking for a couple of. Jean-Pierre Vernant traces the development of nomos to democracy from the agonistic egalitarian experience of warfare, and then widening that in politics to social struggle, the agora, the public square. Opposing speech with speech within the polis seems continually disruptive. Vernant argues as much, but then sees nomos' relationship with justice, or decay, as a rational attempt to bring an end to conflict, to balance antagonistic social forces, to recognize opposing human attitudes. And so when you bring those all into contest, the talking among yourselves about what's the custom, what have we done in the past in this situation, should we do something different, that kind of conversation brings harmony out of contrast.
Thanks. Yeah.
Such balance of order was no longer hierarchical, but lay in maintaining equilibrium between powers that were now equal. Mostly this equilibrium of forces was by no means static. It encompassed opposition. It was formed out of conflict. The welfare of the state rests in the middle. And there's a reciprocity that speech kind of orders the competition to. one of the cool places I've stood at in Athens is the Pnyx up above the Agora, and that's where the citizens met. 5,000 of them on the mountaintop. And what I found fascinating about that is in the early classic period, the speaker spoke to the 5,000 in front of him, but in the background was the Agora and the Acropolis, reminding him what the values were. It was later, after they lost the democracy, that they turned the podium so the back of the speaker was to now, and the 5,000 looked out over. And you can argue various reasons for why that may have, that change may have been done. The Greeks were pretty clear about their need for shared values. Pericles, in his great speech, talks about written and unwritten law. But even more interesting, at the height of their democracy, nomos was clearly also an architectural, artistic, and civic display. Pericles had those things put on the Acropolis, the frieze, the hieroglyphs, to remind people what their duty was, what their values were. Nomos for Athens was clearly an architectural, civic display in art and ritual in the Acropolis, in formal debate on the Pnyx, in the customs and conventions of the Agora, and in the arts of the theater, song, dance, festivals, and public speeches. And we have a similar thing today, although you might say that we have so much input coming in, it's really kind of hard to define. It's hard for us to sort through the chaos, you might say. Or maybe that's what the value of a liberal education class is to help students sort through all of that.
Was there a period of time, was time or the amount of time they spent in these, in deciding these cultural things a factor? I mean, today we live in a world where knowledge will move at the speed of light, and by the time you're handing the staff to the next person, the person before has already changed their mind.
Yeah, to make a long story short, I try to address modern media in some sections of this. On the other hand, we can portray commonalities faster too, and more broadly too. I'm thinking about certain TV shows which are seen by large numbers of people. Even the way we kind of, Freud would say, we civilize violence in the NFL. I mean, that's a lesson too. I mean, how do we make all that kind of natural violent part of humans, how do we kind of bring that under control? We have sports to do that. So this sets in motion a lot of different questions about how we can do that in the modern agora. I remember when I first heard the word internet, 1992, and all the talk the first 5 years was that it was the modern agora, it was the modern marketplace of ideas. Now it has turned out that a lot of that is for sale now. I mean,
More the modern coliseum for circus.
yeah, but that still doesn't change the fact that we have technological ways to get to that if we want to. A lot of thoughts popping in my head, but I'm holding off. I'm holding down at the moment. One of the interesting outcomes of nomos in a collaborative setting, I ran into this quote by Gene Kranz. Anybody remember Gene Kranz? He was the flight director for Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. He was reminiscing about those flights, and he noted the collaborative nature of his flight team. He said, "We were really operating right on the boundaries of all of our knowledge, and the key was teamwork." So creativity comes out of that nomos collaboration too. Also, there's been research at MIT that says the problem-solving ability of if they separate members of the group and test them separately, the problem-solving ability of the individual members can't come close to the problem-solving ability when they give the similar problems to the group as a whole. So we know that this kind of, you can see where this is going with learning. We know where this kind of learning can go if we can harness it in some way better than we do. I'm going to skip the whole section here, which talks about freedom of speech and freedom to speak, which is obviously under attack all over in the last 10 years or so. But that's the essence of the nomos collaborativeness. Questions before I go to Kairos? With a logos-based education stressing consistency of thought, word, and action, one in which decisions on issues critical to one's context are made based on group norms and goals, defined to meet the needs of the moment, we find the catalyst for decision-making in the Greek principle of kairos. Let me give you an example. Well, let me give you two examples, a historic one first. You might be familiar with Robert Kennedy's visit to Muncie on April 4th, 1968?
I wasn't there, but I'm aware.
You weren't?
It was about a year before me.
About a year? Okay. Well, he spoke at Ball State in the old Irving Gym. The photos are, if you go to Bracken, are incredible. On the flight to Indianapolis, he hears about Martin Luther King's assassination. The kairos of the moment, he's giving a speech in Indy, not just in Indy, but in the park in the black part of town. The police tell him not to go. In fact, there's a fantastic video of him coming down Meridian, heading toward the park. No police, the police escort peels off. The only two guys in the car with him, you consider bodyguards, are two offensive linemen from the Los Angeles Rams. He goes to that park, and if you read the speech, I didn't know about the speech until shortly after coming here. Yeah.
I just pulled it up on YouTube.
But it's etched on his eternal flame in D.C.
It's etched on his memorial.
Yeah, and that's when I went back to read the speech. It makes hair crawl on the back of your neck. By the way, Martin Luther King's speech the night before he died, hair crawls. He talks
don't
about,
read it, there's a recording, you should hear
Yeah.
it, give it, it's extraordinary.
Martin Luther King talks about going to meet he says, I'm not going to see the promised land, and if you know Moses. It just makes hair crawl on the back. That, and he's speaking off words he just put on an envelope on the plane. That rhetorical ability. And what major city in the Midwest did not burn in the next year? Indianapolis. I went to Xavier in 1971, and it was still burned out near Xavier. That is rhetorical kairos. He brought together speech, logos, nomos, look at his references, and phronesis at the moment of kairos. Give you another example. We used to have a course at Ball State, which was considered by the administration remedial, and they were going to eliminate, for PR purposes, remedial classes. But if we gave them a really good argument, we could keep it under different guise. The committee I was working with, the math guy laughs. You know what this is, 099 math. My committee meets for about 2 months. We have all kinds of options. I'm home reading something else for some other class, and this organizational principle comes out of this thing. I take it back, give it to the committee, and at that moment, the committee goes, that's our answer. And it's not only, it's the moment, but it's also the moment at which all the questions get answered. And so it's not content-less, it catalyzes the nomos, it catalyzes the context into decision. So you see, this is not prudence. This kairos is a timely moment, and you need to grab that moment. In the Renaissance, kairos is described as Mercury flying by with a bald front and a long lock of hair, a forelock, And in Shakespeare's Othello, it's called grabbing the forelock. Time goes like this, and you go like that, and you're already gone. And that's the way kairos is depicted in the Renaissance. A good rhetorician understands kairos and understands when the kairotic moment occurs. Normally I wouldn't read this paragraph, but Nicole's sitting right over there. Nicole Cardassilaris is a grad student of mine who did a great study about ancient Greek art and how the visual depictions were early indications of Greek kairos. This is a quote from her dissertation.
It's awesome.
She does not know this. I was going to do this. Found that etymologically, kairos centers around the concept of due measure, proportion, fitness, and opportuneness. She also argued that textual evidence suggests that it was part of habitual Greek thought, not academic thinking, but thinking vital to such critical human ventures as fishing, farming, sailing, archery, weaving, and warfare. Long before kairos became a concept defined and idealized by philosophy, rhetoric, and the visual arts, it acted as, quote, a dynamic force that the Greeks became aware of through their direct experiences with their environment. So when is it the best time to plant this? When is it the best time to go to fish for this particular for this particular fish? Kairos is a moment in time forces human decisions that, quote, result in success or failure, life or death, honor or dishonor, later becoming generalized as part of establishing harmony in life, or harmonia. I love that quote, partly because if you know Jean Piaget, Piaget talks about how intellectually we're assaulted by forces to assimilate and accommodate. I can't remember usually which is which, but one of them is we adapt ourselves to the incoming sensory information. But more defensively, the other one is we adapt the information to what we want it to say, which is, I think, the more dangerous one. Piaget talks about we're always under assault with assimilation and accommodation, and we seek psychologically moments of equilibration. In other words, where things, I got that settled, I got that decision made, like the committee felt when we made that decision about that. That's the harmonia that I like, where all things come into harmony. Now, the world doesn't allow you to enjoy that for very long, but the moments that you get that, kind of like the runner's high, you know, when it's all working together, you feel much better than you probably actually are doing. Meredith, Marcia Baxter Magolda talks about developmentalness of students from 18, she studies them to the age of 30. Anybody have children in the mid-20s to late 20s? She says that students eventually come to be able to deal with the contextual learning, kind of the chaos of contextual learning, when they're 28 or so years old. So they're still putting together, they're trying, this is her quote.
Still hope for you, Adam.
Well, this is her talking about students in their late 20s, that they had the power to construct meanings of their experiences, yet simultaneously realize that the world was beyond their control. Their own voices became the foundation, interpreting the world in a way that was workable for them. They came to both trust their own perspectives as a basis for their commitments to self, others, and community, and to hold a firm conviction in a tentative world. In other words, they could make decisions, feel that this was the right one for now, knowing that the forces might change that decision later on. And it's that moment of kind of grace, you might say, where you say, okay, this is my decision. This is my, I do this with conviction, but I know there are other possibilities out there. What were the name of the little 2-year-old, the little twins you took care of in Austin?
Stephen and Alexandra.
I saw Stephen when he was 2. Walk up to his mother, she was cooking dinner, and say to me, come over to me first, and went, I'm going to get some cookies. And I said, I don't think so. We're having dinner in a few minutes. And he goes, no. He says, I want to go up to my mom and I'm going to say, I want some cookies. And she's going to say no. And I'm going to say, yeah, but I know where they are. And she's going to say, okay. And she's going to give them to me. Played out exactly the way he said. Came back with a cookie and went, see? Remember, when I said earlier, the rhetorical tradition of liberal education is in us. We know what this stuff is. We just have to mature it and develop it, and for educators, learn how to foster it.
Stephen's now a lawyer.
Yes, he's not going to see this. Okay, that's my speed through the rhetoric tradition of liberal education. But I want you to look at that quote I showed you earlier. As rhetorical humans, we use logos, speaking, thinking, in context of nomos, our cultural, to seek phronesis, practical wisdom, deciding how and when to speak and act through kairos, the timely. Kairos catalyzes logos, phronesis, and nomos. It pulls them together because until there's a context, they're just flying around. All that knowledge you have about some social science situations just flying around out there until kairos. I remember a student going to study abroad at WPI, and this was reported in the Chronicle, and she said we were supposed to work on helping the village in Africa set up a drainage system after we helped them pump water out of the ground for drinking water and then drain it. She said we had it all set when we left. So we got over there, got to the village, saw the people, saw what we had in hand, threw it all out the window. Because the context catalyzes the knowledge. At the decisive moment, rhetoric becomes meaningful at that moment. In a rhetorical tradition of liberal education, kairos releases power in human life. It turns logos, phronesis, and nomos from static concepts to dynamic principles of living. Make better sense now than it did?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to do the rest of this fairly quickly so we can do some speculation. Chapter 2 is on the humanities. If we are logos-driven people, says Isocrates, what then are the humanities? People use liberal arts, liberal education, humanities back and forth. I'm telling you, humanities has nothing to do with this subject matters, although that's what the National Endowment defines them as. I know because every day I went to get coffee, I went by the history of art, the art history core curriculum class. Students aren't studying the humanitatis there. They're studying a subject matter that they're going to do in tests, except when Nicole taught it. I know because I would watch, I could see what was on the computers from the back door. They're not, first of all, they're not studying a subject matter. Secondly, they're in there knowing they're going to take a test on it, and that's how they're going to get the grade, and then they're going to flush it. So it has nothing to do with subject matters. The humanities is this. Our humanities, we're an embodied being characterized by those concepts who navigate the tensions within thinking, saying, and doing, but also within ourself and society. Baxter McGolda talks about young kids having to do that. And between nature and nurture. This tension is really important. There are no laid out decisions in real life. You have to navigate the tensions you have between this option, this option. Aristotle says rhetoric deals with those things about which there's not one answer, which is just about everything. For him, dialectic was subject matter knowledge. Rhetoric dealt with things that were always contestable. And there's always tension. There's always tension between yourself and what other people want. There's always tension between what might be best for you with what might be best for them. Ask any parent. There's also tension between nature and nurture, unless we're not telling students the truth about that. Meanwhile, our abilities are maturing for navigating tension, our ability to reflect, our ability to become increasingly intentional, our ability to set goals and expectations, increasing empathy and humility, becoming comfortable with ambiguity. All of those, except, by the way, empathy and humility, are characteristics of what Piaget calls formal operational thought, which is the advanced thinking that human beings do. Humility is interesting because I have about 8 writers, nationally known writers on liberal education, who say we could use a real dose of humility in liberal education. And they go through the reasons why humility is not currently and is needed in liberal education. I've got some of that in here, but like I said, I'm going to spin through that. This, to me, is what our humanitatis is, what our humanity is. In other words, this is the foundation for the rhetoric part. This is our human nature. You notice there's not anything in there about art, nothing in there about literature, nothing in there about philosophy and theology, because to me that all comes from the nomos of your culture or shared culture. It could be for us Western culture, plus American culture, plus maybe our ethnic culture, plus maybe our local culture, plus maybe our family culture, all kind of blend into that pot of nomos. Okay, really quickly, how's this boil down into learning? Well, that's the summary paragraph for the chapter 3. In summary, learning must be context-based. Now, there's time to learn skills. There's time to learn mathematical skills. You just need to do that. It's time to learn grammatical skills. But they learn them best. They put them into practice in real situations. Learning must be context-based. Knowing and learning within context should enable students to master specific abilities while also working to integrate those abilities within more complex sets of abilities. That's where expert knowledge goes, or novice knowledge goes to expert knowledge. Expert knowledge is defined as these larger blocks of abilities and skills. And experts have to move, like, I hate to call myself an expert in writing, but that's what they hire me for. And I take novice writers and help them become more expert writers by doing certain things. Contextual knowing and learning is collaborative. There's nomos. Expressing thought through language. There's logos. Students learn to use practical wisdom, phronesis, to face ambiguity and competing interests and to make decisions fit for the moment. Kairos. Decisions that solve problems within their personal, professional, and civic lives. That's how the rhetorical tradition of liberal education becomes educational pedagogy. I think the research is pretty clear about this. So what the research has not sorted out very well is when do we do that versus skill learning? How do you mix skill learning in this learning? Skill learning is easier to, quote, teach. I don't use the word teach very often anymore. Because when I use the word teach, it sounds too much like I'm making students know stuff. And that's not where my principles are anymore. My thinking has to match my speaking. So I talk about learning a lot more than I talk about teaching. Really quickly, if you go through the literature, and this is chapter 3, what has become known as high-impact practices, or practices that are known to improve learning at almost all levels, are almost all infiltrated by rhetorical principles. The problem is faculty members try to do this stuff without the knowing the rhetorical principles. So the pedagogy is not intentional. And if it's not intentional, you can't build things on things. They become very isolated things. So you can read through these. And Ball State does a lot of these different. In fact, we have a whole administrative office dedicated to doing these things now. Although I don't think, because if we really did these things, there's a way, by the way, you can assess these things. And I'm guessing they're not assessed that way. I know for the very long time, what we used to call immersive learning was almost all assessed merely by surveying students. Okay, students' ideas are important, especially at the formal operational level. But that's not real learning, say the accreditors. You got to get to real learning. What are they doing in context for real problems? But remember, rhetorical traditional liberal education is in us. So humans can stumble on really nice teaching practices based on this. The question is, we need to make them systematic and intentional. Humans can even stumble on whole programs based on these. And chapter 4 lays out extensive case studies. I did case studies with all the universities to show that those entire programs, not just individual practices, but entire programs were built around these rhetorical principles. I picked this up by going to their sessions at national conferences. When I wrote these up and sent them back to them for their review, most of them were really surprised to see the reading for these. You know, they had done these things because in their professional sense, it was the best thing to do. And they knew those practices in the previous screen. But if you know the rhetorical principles behind them, you can become more intentional and systematic with them. Also, you can assess based on that too, a lot better. Okay, last. The Greeks had a word called paideia, which was about culture and education. It often meant the same thing because we educate our young into our culture. So the last chapter is about what kind of paideia do we need to become not only a proving ground for rhetorical traditional liberal education, but also can then cycle it back and make the rhetorical tradition even stronger. That last program, by the way, the faculty-led assessment at St. Edward's University, one of the things that came out of there after they reviewed putting that faculty assessment in place was they tried to use the same principles in solving other problems in the university, which not only built on a good, strong rhetorical tradition, but if they could do that, it would further strengthen and build on the tradition itself. So it's like self-strengthening if you can make this work. So the paideia is an ecosystem of logos-based humanities within a society in which these principles are respected, fostered, and developed. Movement toward in paideia gives a dynamicness to logos-based education and culture that propels us toward excellence, arete, an ecosystem of morality, if you will. A system that's moving toward excellence has morality to it. Morality emerges not from ideals set or ideals reached, but from the process of moving toward our aspirations. Today, when all values are unstable, this is a good time to return to logos as the stable, essential, defining characteristic of the human, where constantly clarifying one's logos is a lifelong pursuit. So it's a self-feeding system if you can establish it in some way. And I think I saw that at St. Edward's. Okay. Some of you only came for the last part. And my notes are very thin on this because I'm moving from something I created and I know very well to something I only speculate about. In the fall of 1980, and I want to apologize first because most of my examples come from Catholicism. That's my background and my formal training up through college. But I'm sure these arguments broaden out through Christianity as a whole in different ways. In 1980, I sat in Jim Kanavy's graduate class on classical rhetoric, and he was talking about what would become this book, Greek Rhetorical Origins of Christian Faith. And in fact, here are the handouts from that class. And you can compare them to the actual diagrams as they actually showed up in the book about 7 years later. Jim's argument was that you can't understand. Jim says, by the way, I have some interest in historical rhetoric as well as in its relevance to the rise and spread of Christianity. Yeah, some interest. The guy was to me, he was a genius. He says, possibly the most influential of all writers who spoke positively of pistis was Isocrates. If you look at the Greek word for faith, it's pistis, which is the same word in rhetoric for persuasion. So that led Canavi to wonder whether he did the research, as he always did. His books are like this. And he found out that the theologians didn't really agree as to where pistis came from. And so it struck him that maybe it came from rhetoric. Why? He'd have to establish what he calls the historic argument in here. He'd have to establish, I'll pass this around, that Greek rhetoric was well known in Judea and Israel of the 1st century AD, which he does in his historical argument. The number of Greek cities within 25 miles of Nazareth were 12. Quote, our survey of the schools in Palestine in the Hellenistic period shows that they were massively under the influence of Greek education, particularly in law and rhetoric. Greek education found its way into the Greek schools of the free city-states and into the Hebrew schools, both at the secondary and at the higher level in the schools and in the synagogues. The Greek rhetoric was taught in a formalized way in the Greek schools, but they infiltrated into all the Hebrew schools of education. He analyzes 491 instances of pistis in the New Testament, all the verbs and noun forms of pistis, and he maps them along 6 characteristics of rhetoric, particularly Aristotelian rhetoric: ethos, pathos, logos, levels of certainty. And his argument is that that the Greek concept of faith largely influenced, if not determined, the Christian concept of faith in the 1st century. So, not being interested in a simple hypothesis thought, I wonder if all of Christianity could be better seen through the rhetoric tradition of liberal education. Knowing that Isocrates dominated into the year 1000, if you read an Augustinian rhetoric, which is 400 AD, it's almost all logos based, as I'm trying to lay it out for you. And Plato didn't come back until the Renaissance, with the Neoplatonians especially. So this raises the speculative question: how are logos, pathos, and kairos, nomos, how would those give us a different basis in which to think about Christianity? This is the first one. This is the opening of John. Most of you recognize this. It was written in Greek. It wasn't written in Latin. When Jerome translated it, logos between verbum, word in Roman has none of the logos characteristics that I've laid out for you with Isocratean rhetoric. In the beginning was the Word was in God's presence, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh, thought gets manifested into concrete form, and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of an only Son coming from the Father, filled with enduring love. So logos has a very foundational sense, is connected with Isocratean, Christian logos with Isocratean logos. When I was in grade school, God bless the nuns, but then again, rhetoric was not known in those days, or largely taught. You'd ask the nuns about something like this, and they'd say, "Son, it's a mystery." My response is, "Ma'am, it's rhetoric." Remember, in Logos, the human is not sure about the connection between the divine and the human. The human, for Isocrates, expresses the thinking into the words and then carries them out into action. How is a Christian sure about that movement? We got the living, breathing human example of Logos walking in concrete form. This would make a whole lot more sense, I think, when you look at it this way than when you think about it more as a theological mystery. The people walking around in Palestine, especially the more educated Greek ones, this made perfect sense to them.
Well, I've read an excerpt from Heraclitus, to go back earlier, that Heraclitus has a sentence that is, in the arche was the Logos. And Heraclitus lived in Ephesus. Is that several, I don't know how many hundred years before John also lived in Ephesus. And I've heard that there's my understanding is there's a connection even there between him kind of standing on Heraclitus' shoulders and completing him.
This is why I only speculate about this stuff, because I'll never do this research, but it would be fun to see it. It would be fun to see the pieces. St. Irenaeus, a 2nd century Catholic bishop, says, God became human so that humans could become God. And how do humans become God? By looking at the example. This is not about esoteric theologic arguments to the 1st century Christian. This is about the living, breathing human being of thought into word, into action. Much of this is summed up in this is from a particular, there's a bishop currently, he's in Minnesota right now, his name is Bishop Robert Barron. He's become a giant in communication in the Catholic Church. His websites, classes, he says, much of this is summed up in the oft-repeated patristic adage that God became human so that humans might become God. Well, that can't work in a Platonic sense because there's a lot of esoteric ideals to understand there. It can work in a human sense just by following the human example. Pope Benedict in Verbum Domini, now the word is not simply audible, not only does it have voice, now the word has a face, one that we can see, that of Jesus of Nazareth. Christianity is a religion of the Word of God, not a written and mute word, but an incarnate and living word. In other words, you go into the whole concept of the incarnation, and it's actually Greek logos at its base. I'm just brushing through these. Have some fun if you have some thoughts to throw in. I'm going to look at nomos next. I did phronesis first the other way, but this makes more sense than nomos. So what is the nomos of Christianity? What is the excellence of Christianity? On one occasion, a lawyer stood up to pose him this problem. Teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? Jesus answering, what is written in the law? How do you read it? He replied, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, you have answered correctly. Do this and you shall live. There are not 613 Hebraic laws at work here. There's 2 principles, all based on love, all based on relationship, all based on human beings, the nomos of gathering and what your relationship are in that gathering.
For Jesus' response there also goes to who's my brother, right? Or who's my neighbor, rather.
Right.
Right? And then he goes, Jesus introduces the concept of natural equals, which you've highlighted in Isocrates. There's a concept of natural equals at the root of it that goes against, at least from your point of view, the Renaissance reading of Plato,
Right.
the Neoplatonic point of view.
I
often encouraged to take when we read Paul.
Yeah. In fact, I have a line from Paul coming up here in a second. Phronesis. Live according to what you have learned and accepted, what you have heard me say and seen me do. not just what I say, not what I think, not what I say, but do. That's the do is the pragmatic phronesis to make the contextual argument. All of this takes place in a context, which of course always leads me back to rhetoric. There's also a passage to talk about by their fruits you know them, so that the thinking and the saying don't find fulfillment until you get to the doing, the fruit part. And of course, this is all based on love, which by its nature is relational. I want to get in this point because this is really important. There's a Greek concept called amartia. When people think about sin, I think it's an important way to think about the difference in this view versus the idea of sin. Sin is a failing, as a fall from God, as a breaking of a divine law, like a spiritual crime. But the root meaning of sin in the scriptures, and the word is amartia. Amartia is best understood by us as an archery term, that you aim for something and you hit it or not. And if you don't hit it, you readjust and you hit it again. That's a lot different than sin as a failing. The word amartia is the word that gets often translated as sin. But it's best seen in rhetoric, in a rhetorical sense, as aiming and then re-aiming and then re-aiming and then re-aiming. It's not as a fault. There's not something inherently wrong with you. It's a missing and a re-aiming. I realize that sin is not so much a specific violation of a law, but rather a failure to live up to holiness, godlikeness, which I have received. Then I see sin differently and life differently. So when I do this, I realize I should maybe aim again to do this differently, not do it the same way. And it's best to see sin more as an archery term rather than a divine failing.
Right. So the missing the mark idea there is how I understand sin and amartia. So how would that Scripture tells us that separates us from God? How would
Separates?
redirecting?
Okay, this is my amateur,
Yeah.
and if we're aiming to follow the divine example,
Yeah.
we've not separated, but we've gotten off the track.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get ourselves back on the track.
Can we?
Yes.
How?
I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade.
Okay. Fair.
And lastly, kairos. I love this passage. He says, he came to Nazareth where he had been reared and entered a synagogue on the Sabbath as he was in the habit of doing. He stood up to do the reading. When the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed him, he unrolled the scroll and found the passage. Just don't read off of here. And found a passage where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, therefore he has anointed me. He has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, release to prisoners, to announce a year of favor from the Lord." Rolling up the scroll, just think of the dynamic, the narrative of this. Just put yourself in a position to try to think of this. Rolling up the scroll, he gave it back to the assistant, sat down. Everybody's watching him, and he says, "Today, this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." Boom. This guy we know down the street, is saying that the time that we've waited for has come. Oftentimes in mostly Protestant theology, this is known as kairos with a capital K, the coming of the Messiah into human life. And certainly that's true. I would look for kairos in also other smaller ways too. Bishop Barron writes, "The moment has arrived, the privileged time, the kairos, something that human beings have been longing for and striving after and hoping to see has appeared. In Jesus of Nazareth, the divine and human have come together in a salvific way, and this reconciliation is the long-awaited kingdom of God. So, like I said, I just do a little speculation about kairos, or logos, phronesis, nomos, kairos. And if you look at those from a rhetorical sense, in the rhetoric tradition of liberal education, they mean a lot more, to me they mean a lot more as a foundational sense of Christianity that we come back to, as if you're a believer, you come back to. The New Testament is not rules-based. There are 613 rules in the Old Testament. There are 2 in the New Testament. It's not a theology book. It's a book based on stories, on narratives about how to act, how to behave. Logos, phronesis, nomos, all static until they're catalyzed by kairos, by the charges to love God and love your neighbor. Within Catholicism, I would just say, historically for Catholics, Vatican II, early 1960s, I was a youngster, Vatican II did not fail. The paideia needed to grow and mature, the church did. I just heard a bishop yesterday saying, what do you mean we need a new way of looking at things? The rules work just fine. Yeah, if you're in that tradition, they work just fine. They maybe not work so fine if you think about it from a rhetorical position. All of this reorientation I've talked about in the last, couple hours, takes effect in the face of 1,000 years of the Neoplatonics and the Enlightenment. If we're going to shake all that off, we have to have an intentional, systematic attempt to get back to a rhetorical tradition. The rhetorical tradition of liberal education is not anything outside of you. In one sense, if I've made that clear to you tonight, then my goal has been to awaken that in you. And if I've only accomplished one thing, then that's what I'll deal with.
Will you say it one more time, that last piece?
The rhetorical tradition of liberal education is not anything outside of you. It's not like you don't know the catechism or you don't know Platonic ideals. You know inside of you from the time you were 2, at least, logos, kairos, phronesis, nomos. The issue is to make that intentional and systematic in our lives, in our culture, and in our education. In that sense, I think we'd be a lot better off than we are today. So, let's leave it.